I'm Herman Beavers, Professor of English and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm going to talk about why poetry matters. So one of the things that I've discovered as someone that writes poetry and teaches poetry is that teaching it is a challenge because I think in a world where students are so used to dealing with images and dealing with things that are interpreted for them, poetry is sometimes frightening for them. I mean, I think I have graduate students who are just absolutely terrified of the thought of studying and reading and teaching poetry, though they've gotten better over the years because I just keep sort of hammering away at them. But the thing about poetry is that it demands that we slow down, that we really think about the relationship between sound and the word on the page, and that poems are, whatever else they are, they're sonic events. They're this thing that came out of song and singing. In fact, poetry, the roots of the word poetry can be traced back to the word for song. So if you think about it, studying poetry is not quite on par with studying music, but it is a reminder of the way in which human beings found their way to poetry as a way to think about history, as a way to think about memory, as a way to think about how do we go about talking about and telling the important stories of what it means to be human. So that poetry, for all of its challenges, we know that part of the challenge is that one has to have a sort of grasp of poetry's technical aspects. But I think that I've had conversations with people in communities in Philadelphia and outside of Philadelphia about poetry. The thing that I think you have to remind people of when you talk about poetry is that ultimately, what's the point? What's the point that the writer is trying to make in his or her poem? And what sort of epiphany do they want us to reach by the time we get to the end of a poem? So if you think about the fact that poems are organized around lines and stanzas and line breaks, one of the things that a poem is always about, and I tell students that they're in my poetry workshop to think about this when they write a poem. You know, as you move down a poem line by line, the poem is giving you information. And I think it becomes therefore important to slow down because you want to really grasp what information the poem is trying to give you in a particular instance of this particular line. But the other thing is, and I'm thinking here of what Richard Hugo says in his book, The Triggering Town, every sentence in a poem should be different than the sentence that came before, which is to say that it should reach for something different than the sentence that came before it. And if it's a good poem, if it's a poem that does its work well, you really don't think about that. And so in the midst of a good poem, what is often really interesting to me is that people come away thinking that poetry is this really easy thing that anybody can do. But when it's done well, as Toni Morrison might put it, the seams don't show. That the labor and the difficulty and the sort of technical architectural aspects of the poem are so integral to how the poem sounds that you really don't get hung up on the structure. You get really sort of focused on what the poem means. So I hope that what I've said really induces people to think more about why poetry is important, why studying poetry is important, because ultimately it's really a way to get in touch with the song of ourselves.